Benvenuti a tutti e a tutte al workshop su autismo e ricerca partecipativa. Ringraziamo sia i relatori che le relatrici che i partecipanti di essere qui oggi e do la parola a Giovanni Granato, che è un ricercatore dell'ISTC-CNR, è un ricercatore autistico, si presenterà e racconterà che cos'è il gruppo di lavoro sulla su autismo e ricerca partecipativa. Vai Giovanni.
Allora, salve a tutti, salve a tutti. Vi condivido lo schermo brevemente per presentarmi quello che è il gruppo di lavoro. Allora, innanzitutto mi presento, io sono Giovanni Granato, sono ricercatore di scienze, tecnologie e della cognizione e spiego, e faccio ricerca su vari temi, fra i quali anche l'autismo, quindi posso dire di essere una persona che quindi rappresenta varie categorie insieme di questo gruppo. Allora, partiamo dal progetto. Questo gruppo di lavoro, questo workshop rientra nel progetto Piazza Missione, ascoltare la comunità autistica. Il progetto è proposto dall'Università Sapienza, coordinato da il Salvatore Ioti e Ilaria Minio-Paluello, che abbiamo qua, e ci sono vari partners, fra i quali abbiamo anche studi clinici, per esempio Studio Caretto, e varie associazioni che lavorano nel campo. Allora, in generale il progetto, la missione in generale del progetto è ascoltare la comunità autistica e migliorare la conoscenza dell'autismo, l'accessibilità degli studenti autistici nell'università e anche la ricerca sull'autismo. Oggi ci focalizziamo sulla ricerca, la ricerca scientifica. La ricerca scientifica partecipativa, ovvero che cosa intendiamo per partecipativa? Intendiamo una ricerca che includa le persone considerate, in questo caso le persone autistiche, all'interno del processo di ricerca. Quindi creare un gruppo di lavoro che possa guidare in questa missione. Allora, procediamo, quindi chi siamo? Qual è questo gruppo di lavoro? Chi siamo noi? Allora, noi siamo un gruppo di persone decisamente eterogenee, siamo 27 persone, ci sono varie categorie di gruppo, ci sono persone autistiche, neurotipiche, ricercatori, non ricercatori, genitori di persone nello spettro, e come vedete dal grafico B ci sono un congruo numero di ricercatori e non ricercatori, e ci sono 20 persone nello spettro, 7 persone neurotipiche, ma importante notare il grafico C, perché ci sono varie categorie sovrapposte. Per esempio, abbiamo 5 ricercatori autistici, tra i quali ci sono anche io, e 5, nel grafico D possiamo notare che ci sono 5 genitori di bambini autistici, 4 dei quali sono anch'essi autistici. Quindi abbiamo, direi, un ottimo mix di varie categorie, quindi possiamo essere molto rappresentativi della comunità. Allora, procediamo. Cosa abbiamo fatto in questo gruppo di ricerca di lavoro? Allora, ci siamo formati. Fondamentalmente ci siamo formati come? Abbiamo fatto sia autoformazione, quindi vari relatori all'interno del gruppo hanno formato su varie tematiche, per esempio la storia, la metodologia della ricerca partecipativa, ma abbiamo avuto anche molte interazioni con le istituzioni specializzate e focalizzate sulla ricerca partecipativa. Vorrei far notare il numero 6, il gruppo 6, valutazione dei progressi del gruppo, delle conoscenze acquisite e dinamiche del gruppo. Perché? Perché non solo ci siamo formati e abbiamo anche avuto un'ottima interazione con le istituzioni nel campo, ma abbiamo fatto anche un'autovalutazione. Era importante come gruppo di lavoro che noi ci valutassimo il progresso del gruppo, le conoscenze acquisite, ma molto importante anche le dinamiche di gruppo, le interazioni e l'accessibilità. Quindi ci siamo focalizzati su vari aspetti della ricerca. Cosa faremo oggi? Sicuramente l'avrete visto dalla locandina, ma ve lo ripeto. Vorremmo far conoscere la ricerca partecipativa e promuoverla nei laboratori di ricerca italiana. E grazie a questi interventi che faremo di ricercatori e ricercatrici, persone autistiche che hanno esperienza diretta con la ricerca partecipativa. Quindi, appunto, in generale il workshop si propone come uno spazio di formazione, di dialogo, quindi fate le domande che volete e siate curiosi. Cosa faremo in futuro? Un piccolo Vorremmo creare un gruppo di consulenza specializzato su autismo e ricerca partecipativa da questo gruppo di lavoro che possa promuovere e supporti la ricerca della comunità autistica in Italia quindi migliorare la ricerca sull'autismo e renderla molto più partecipativa di quanto sia ora. Quindi divertitevi e grazie per la vostra attenzione.
Grazie Giovanni. Ehm, Diamo il benvenuto alla prima keynote speaker che è Liz Pellicano. Liz Pellicano è una psicologa, una ricercatrice nell'ambito della psicologia cognitiva, dello sviluppo e dell'educazione. She's a professor at University College London and who was formerly a professor at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. Quindi thank you again, Liz, for joining us with your expertise, and I let you present.
Right, can you see my slides?
Yes.
I'm just going to move forward just a second. So I just want to say, you can definitely see them?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. I'm just going to move that down. Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me to give the first talk in your workshop. The workshop looks absolutely amazing. You've put together an amazing workshop, so yeah, it's brilliant. I feel even more privileged to be able to talk about a topic that is really close to my own heart and affects so many people so deeply. I love autism research. It's the driving force of my professional life. But for too long, autism research has listened to too few voices and been open to too narrow a range of perspectives. And as a result, we haven't understood autism as well as we might otherwise have. There is now, though, an opportunity to change that. So today I'm going to argue for a power shift, a move to a more participatory approach to autism research, a move that I believe will enable us all to understand or know autism better, and at the same time to make a more powerful contribution to the lives of autistic people and their families. So as you know, the lives of autistic people remain deeply difficult in every country across the globe. So there are wonderful kids, full of enormous creativity, warmth, insight, and potential. They often grow up to have the hardest of lives. Even in advanced economies, far too many autistic people are unable to enjoy full and enjoyable lives, especially when compared to non-autistic ones. None of this is due to a lack of investment in autism per se. Although there are, of course, huge holes in the safety net for autistic people across the world, there have been huge efforts to invest resources in discovering about autism and making a difference. So billions of dollars worldwide has been spent, especially in autism research, over the last 2 decades. So about 18 years ago, I think, President George W. Bush signed the US Combating Autism Act, which appropriated almost $1 billion US dollars to autism research and provided grant programs for states in the United States to develop autism screening, early diagnosis, and intervention programs for children. In the United Kingdom, the funding portfolio of our Medical Research Council increased its resources for autism research. And in Australia, where I have been for about 5 years, the Autism CRC was established and funded to the tune of almost 30 million Australian dollars, making it the world's first national cooperative research effort focused on autism. And this investment has had a huge impact on the amount of research conducted. So these data here that you can see come from the Interagency Coordinating Committee in the US. So that's a committee that essentially helps the US Senate to make decisions about where to what to fund and what areas to fund for autism research. And we contributed data to this particular report. And so we've got the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia. And this is for 2016 alone. So this is 1 year where there were 1,552 autism-related projects, which totaled almost $400 million US dollars in those 4 countries. And obviously, as you can see, the US contributed most of that funding, 92% of that funding. And there's been an enormous explosion, so an exponential surge in publications in autism as a result on autism research. And it far surpasses the growth in other fervent research areas like ADHD. So in the graph, what you can see is on the vertical axis, this is number of publications, so in the thousands. And on the horizontal axis, it's a year. So we started, in the 1940s where there aren't very many. And the red line is specific language impairment or developmental language disorder, which doesn't it goes up a little bit, but not very much. We have ADHD in the purple line, which it's still pretty exponential. But autism research is the pink line, which is going right up. And even for other neurodevelopmental conditions, there's something about autism. So the investment in autism, so all that money being spent on autism research has had a return, in terms of, academic outputs. These are journal publications. But despite this, hugely encouraging trend, the fruits of this research are still not being felt anything like directly enough by the broader autism and autistic communities. In short, we've done all of this work, thousands and thousands of publications, billions of dollars worth of autism research, but where has it got us? I think the time has come to realise that for all the wonderful efforts we've made, the research that we do hasn't changed enough lives. The life chances of millions of autistic people remain extraordinarily bleak. And this has hit home to me recently because my colleagues and I recently completed a major review of the life chances of autistic adults for Nature Reviews Psychology. And for that review, we read hundreds and hundreds of papers looking across 10 major dimensions of quality of life, from physical and mental health to participation in broader society and connection with the natural world. And it was absolutely brilliant to conduct. But the picture in almost every aspect was deeply challenging. Just as you see on this slide, autistic people experience substantial economic inequalities. So despite all of their talents and dedication, only a minority of autistic people enjoy full-time paid employment. More are in some sort of paid work, but this is lower than people from other disability groups, including intellectual disability. And the minority of autistic adults who are employed are all too often in posts that are deemed unsuitable. So either they're not consistent with their skill set, so that's malemployed, or for which they are simply overqualified, so that's underemployed. And the review showed that these inequalities also extend further. So autistic adults are far less likely than non-autistic adults to live independently when they want to do so, or to have friends and more intimate relationships. And many also have co-occurring difficulties with their physical and their mental health, which can be, really debilitating and can require often substantial ongoing support. And most disturbingly, recent evidence suggests that autistic people, die way too many years earlier than non-autistic people do, and they're more likely to die of suicide. And none of us should be satisfied with facts like these. So it's not at all surprising that those of us in autism science are beginning to be the subject of intense scrutiny and criticism within the autistic community. Of course, scientists in general are not necessarily to blame, but increasingly, autistic people themselves are suggesting that the massive public investment in autism science demands a greater return in terms of life chances. And at the moment, they're simply not seeing any of the sorts of benefits that one would hope to see. So the emergence of this criticism and protest is of course part of a broader phenomenon. So in 2018, an editorial in the journal Nature, which is one of the biggest journals in the world, recognized that too much research done in the name of society fails to be of direct use to society, stoking criticism as a result. And as the Nature editorial continued, this is in part because other people, policymakers, politicians, business leaders, don't necessarily take enough notice of the findings of science. But it's also a result of fundamental problems with some of the science itself. That is, it's the ways in which autism science is conventionally conducted, and especially the methods it deploys, that contributes to these less than desired outcomes and the declining faith, public faith in autism science. And I am, of course, not alone in this view. And as the Nature editorial, suggests, the problems, again, go far broader than autism research or autism science alone. Across the health and medical sciences in recent years, leading scholars have been grappling with this question of why massive investment in science, why so much money pours into science, has failed to have the kinds of returns that broader society has a right to expect. So how do we fix that? That's a big question. Well, I think that the answer lies in a dramatic power shift, in the construction of a new participatory approach to research. So involving community members, in our case, autistic people, their family members, and those who support them in research. And that should be an essential part of what we do as autism researchers. It should make our research more relevant to people's everyday lives, more tailored to their needs, and more consistent with their values. Yeah, ever since the idea of autism was, first developed in the 1940s or before that, autism science has typically been designed and conducted without any significant input from autistic people and their families. And I think that's contributed towards research agendas and research methods that rarely relate to the challenges that autistic people face. And when I say input, I mean input beyond being kind of passive participants or subjects in research, because autistic people definitely do that. But input in the decision-making processes around research. So in the design and the implementation of research, and in the analysis, in the interpretation, and in the dissemination of the findings. And as I know from my own work, this lack of involvement results in real feelings of kind of disenfranchisement or frustration. So the image that you can see on your slide, it comes from a focus group that I ran a while ago now for the group of autistic adults, and we were talking about autism research and what their views on it. And one of the adults, looked at me rather skeptically and said, whatever I say, is it really going to influence anyone? And in responding to this problem, researchers have begun to, try and draw upon innovations in participatory, kind of co-designed, co-produced research that already has a long history outside of autism research. So some of you might know about studies co-designed with HIV patients and also in First Nations or Aboriginal communities. It's also an approach currently having sweeping effects on more basic science, so including agriculture, environmental science, where it's widely reported that the processes which draw on the practical wisdom of non-scientists or non-researchers can have a dramatic effect on both the research agenda, so what gets researched, and on the ability of research to discover otherwise hidden explanatory factors. Sorry, I'm not moving. Yeah, here we go. But what do we actually mean by a participatory approach? Well, participatory research essentially means engaging with the community that will be impacted by research to produce that research. So in the case of autism research, that means working together with autistic people and their allies throughout the research process. And participation, in the participatory part of it, can take many forms. Okay, so contemporary models of community involvement have built upon Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation, which she developed in the late 1960s. She was working in the US and looking at town planning. And, you know, they had these bureaucrats that were, you know, that were developing all these town plans. And the citizens themselves weren't involved at all. And so she designed this kind of this ladder of citizen participation to show, how, you know, the nature and extent of community involvement or citizen involvement, in which the rungs of the ladder, so as you move up the ladder, reflect increasing levels of participation and degree of community control in decision making. So that ranges from research that is kind of done to a person, which is most autism research, and then you kind of move up and you go through to educating and informing, all the way to research that is done, you know, as you go to the higher levels of or higher rungs of the ladder, where you have kind of co-production, so you're doing, you know, research with the community, and even further where you've got, you know, community control. So, you know, that the community has power over the decision-making process. And the idea is to increase the degree and nature of community involvement so that you get research that is carried out with or by community members rather than to, on, or for them. And in my own work with my team, we're always striving to move up the ladder to more co-production and ideally community-led research. Now, I'm going to give you some examples in a minute about some of the research that we've been doing. But for now, you might want to think about where you are, you know, in this ladder, where your research or the research that you've taken part in, for example, where that fits in this ladder and where you want it to be. Sorry, hang on one second. Yeah. But just to before we get on to kind of the examples that I'll give you, I think it's really important to talk through, you know, it's almost principles of engagement. And these I'm going to talk through 3 principles: trust, mutual respect, and listening and learning. And these were developed or identified with a group of autistic and non-autistic researchers back in 2016 or 17. We ran a few workshops in London and outside London, actually, and worked together to try and kind of pinpoint what it was that was particularly important about developing relationships with community members. And the first one, perhaps unsurprisingly, is, you know, trust. So many autistic people and their allies who've taken part in autism research report a lack of trust regarding the research process. Many autistic people and parents actually have told us that they often give up their time, their energy, they give their information to researchers, but they don't tend to receive anything in return. So they sometimes, most of the time, they don't even hear about the results of the research that they took part in. And they feel frustrated and kind of, you know, disconnected from that research as a result. So our team kind of suggested that, you know, researchers, both autistic and non-autistic, must build up trust with the people with whom they're working. We need to be honest and committed in our interactions with people, you know, saying what we mean and meaning what we say. So if we say, for example, that we're going to share the results of our project with people, that's what we have to do. The second principle is mutual respect. So autistic people and their allies report being happier with their experiences of contributing to research when they feel respected and their views have been valued by researchers. And this quote clearly attests to this. So one person said, you know, the autism researchers that I've dealt with personally were always interested in what I had to say, as well as my well-being. It recognizes that we need to treat autistic people as people, not just subjects in research, making sure that they feel respected. And the third and final principle is listening and learning. So researchers have expertise in designing and implementing their research. That's what they do. Autistic people have expertise gained from their lived experience of being autistic. Parents of autistic children have expertise, you know, regarding living and caring for someone who's autistic. And professionals have expertise regarding working with a range of autistic people on a daily basis. And some people benefit from expertise in more than one of those areas. It's crucial for those different kinds of expertise to be acknowledged and to be valued. By listening to and learning from other people's expertise and experiences, we can ensure that the research taking place is relevant to those it directly affects. So these three principles, trust, mutual respect, and listening and learning, should be our starting points for any research that we do with autistic people and their families. But we can and should go deeper than this. And what I want to talk about here is the issue of power. The issue of addressing power in the research decision-making process is crucial. I can't tell you how important this is. So participatory approaches, where people are, you know, community members are involved in the decision-making process, you know, they seek to value equally the knowledge of each individual who participates in the project, who contributes to the project. And that means as researchers, we need to address the power differentials within our work. Making sure that everyone gets to have their say, to contribute in the way that they feel most comfortable, and to ensure that those contributions actually have an impact on the research itself. And this is especially important because participatory research can help to redress kind of long-standing power imbalances in the production of knowledge. So for the most part, you know, let's say autism research, non-autistic autism researchers have helped to shape understanding of what autism is and what being autistic looks like. And those who are autistic have often been left out of that conversation. What participatory research does is try to kind of redress that power imbalance by involving those who have the greatest stake, that is autistic people, but who have previously been excluded. But, it's a big but, sharing power in the decision-making process is probably the least straightforward part of participatory approaches. Even well-intentioned participatory studies can get this wrong. So in a survey-based study that my then postdoctoral fellow Jack Den Houting and I did, we were interested in projects that we were interested in looking at the extent and nature of community involvement in a particular set of projects. These were funded in Australia by the Autism CRC, and to be funded by the Autism CRC, you have to have service users on your grant application. Okay, so they were really trying to encourage community involvement right at the outset of a project, because you were putting a grant application in, so you hadn't done the project yet. And we had surveyed the people who had got the grants, who'd been successful, and so we were interested in like what the academics partners had to say, and also the community partners about, you know, about the involvement, about how it all played out. Unfortunately, only one person out of 79 of our survey respondents commented on the issue of power and the power dynamics between non-autistic researchers and autistic community members. And when we analysed the data further, we found that traditional power dynamics remain entrenched in many participants' experience, or in our participants' experiences of the research. So one community partner, an autistic adult, said, you know, we've been asked by university personnel to co-lead projects in order to comply with the funding guidelines, but then we've not always been invited to meetings to plan the research. And another community partner noted, you know, that they hadn't been privy to how things have been run and only know the few things that I've been asked to participate in. So although non-autistic researchers and community members were really enthusiastic about the potential of participatory autism research, these findings highlighted to us, you know, the real limited understanding of what participatory approaches actually mean to researchers. And it also showed that, you know, academic partners continue to retain significant power and control within research partnerships, with an apparent failure to recognise community partners as equal partners in the research process. So that's all a bit depressing, but all is not lost. In the last bit of my talk, I'm going to talk through some examples of my own participatory work. And I'm in no way suggesting that these examples represent the right way to do participatory research. They don't. I don't think there is like one right way to do it. I think participatory research kind of varies with the type of project you're doing, and also who you're working with, and how much time and energy and resources you know, an academic partner and a community partner has to work together. But I hope these two examples just illustrates kind of some of the varied ways in which participatory approaches might take place within research. And the first example comes from our Hidden Histories project. So this was a project in which a team of autistic and non-autistic researchers sought to gather the untold histories of late diagnosed autistic people in mid to late adulthood. So I did this when I was in Australia. We had an amazing team of researchers adopting a participatory approach. So it was the best project I've ever done. It was a real collaboration between non-autistic academics and autistic co-researchers, as well as an autistic advisory group of lay community members, so those who didn't have any research experience, who all actively participated in making decisions about the research. They were involved in getting the funding for the research all the way to disseminating the findings. It was, in other words, you know, a deep and sustained effort at genuine co-production in autism research. We also adopted an oral history approach for this particular study, which an oral history records, you know, recollections of people and groups to preserve their voices and their stories, particularly from groups who have often been marginalised. And it seeks to situate their stories within a particular time and place in history. So we invited late diagnosed autistic adults to share their life histories with us so that we could understand better the consequences of, living without a diagnosis. We wanted to understand what, triggered them getting a diagnosis in mid to late adulthood. And we also wanted to understand the kind of perceived impact of receiving that diagnosis. So to this end, we invited people who were late diagnosed. They had to be born before 1975 to have received a clinical diagnosis after the age of 35 and have spent most of their time living in Australia. So that essentially means that they were ranged between 45 and 72 years. So they were mostly kind of growing up in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, essentially, and 80s. But that means that they were growing up at a time when just autism, definitely in Australia, it just wasn't even a thing. And so they grew up not knowing that they were autistic. We ended up speaking to 28 late diagnosed autistic adults, and these participants were interviewed by one of our two late diagnosed autistic researchers, both Gabby Hall and Joanne Mahoney. And to take part in this project, it involved quite a bit. And this was deliberate. This was part of our kind of the conversations that we had with our autistic partners. Because sharing people's stories, is not an easy task. And we wanted to make sure that we had methods that were safe and respectful and really thorough for people. So we had 4 different sessions. The first one was just to kind of get to meet the autistic researcher, interviewer, and to talk through the consent process and what was going to happen. The second was the oral history interview itself. And this was quite intense. So it lasted from between 1 hour and up to 3 hours of people talking about their life stories. The third session is where we asked people kind of to look over their oral history transcript. So we got it all typed up and people had an opportunity to look over it and to make adjustments if they needed to. And in those first 3 sessions, Gabby and Joanne, so our autistic interviewers, had a lot of contact and engagement with participants, really guiding them through that process and trying to accommodate any needs and preferences where possible, and just genuinely being, super supportive. And then the final session was a follow-up interview on their experiences of taking part in the research, which I'll come to in a minute. But that was either done by me or my wonderful autistic friend and colleague, Wen Lawson. So what did we find out? Well, these adults spoke about, their sense of self and how that had changed over time. They told us about many negative experiences, including trauma, which had shaped how they think about themselves. For most, though not all, autism diagnosis had a really positive impact on their sense of self, allowing them to understand more about their own past and to feel good about their autistic identity. One woman, Tanya, she described, recognizing herself as autistic as a light bulb moment. And another participant, Malcolm, also talked about how the light came on with diagnosis, allowing him to reconstruct my perspective of who I am and who I want to be. And Veronica, who you can see on your slide, described how her transformation in sense of self was linked to autism diagnosis. Veronica said, and what was my life before diagnosis? It was bits and pieces of disconnected things. I was a failure, right? And there was no center. But there was a center, me. The center is I'm autistic, and that explained all of that. Previously, some researchers have said that autistic people have a limited or impaired sense of self. Instead, our results show that, at least definitely some autistic people reflect very deeply on their lives and their changing sense of self-identity over time. Now, we learned a lot from this study, but perhaps most of all was the importance for autistic people of working with autistic researchers in genuine co-production. So our participatory efforts ensured that the research processes, as I said, were, really thorough, they were respectful and supportive of our participants. And being able to talk to an autistic interviewer brought extraordinary rewards. So participants, agreed that telling their stories was made easier because I had an autistic researcher interviewing me. Another person said, I knew she'd get it and get me. This connection allowed them to drop the filters a bit more, to drop the mask. And ultimately, this made them feel safe. So one participant said, it was bloody wonderful to be interviewed by Joanne. I have no objection to being interviewed by anyone that's not autistic, but just knowing that they were set another level of safety within it. If I'm going to offer something, I've got to feel safe about it. So our participants told us that their open and authentic interactions with our autistic researchers meant that they were more forthcoming than they might have been with a non-autistic interviewer, or at least a researcher who was not on their wavelength. They told us things that they might not have shared if they didn't have that person that was on their wavelength. That is to say that the sense of empowerment shared by those autistic people who were given, the opportunity to reflect on their own lives with an autistic researcher provided access to insights that they might not have shared otherwise. Put simply, this meant that we got better, more meaningful research. So that's my first example. My second example comes from a study of a former graduate student of mine, Dr. Katie Gaudian, who's a design researcher here in the UK, and she's in the orangey brownie top. She worked with a service provider here in the UK, the Kingwood Trust, and her kind of task with them was to try and understand the ways in which their clients, their autistic adults who had very high support needs, how they experienced their home environment, and to understand what a design-based approach could do to promote their agency and their well-being. And in so doing, Katie implemented really creative ways of supporting the inclusion of autistic people with intellectual disabilities, who were often also non-speaking, in her research. So Katie's starting point was that the physicality of the world and what it affords is critical for an autistic person's understanding of themselves, their understanding of other people, and of the world around them. And importantly, for others' understanding of them as well. So Katie described, during the design process, she visited the adults in their homes on many, many occasions. And essentially what she did was ethnography. So she observed the ways in which they engaged with their environment, including in the garden, in their home space, and also their engagement with everyday objects like washing machines, like vacuum cleaners. And once she kind of, was present enough, once she'd gained the adults' trust, these initial observations were followed by interactions with the adults. She started to interact with them on their own terms, where she mirrored their favorite activities as a way of creating that reciprocal interaction. So she describes here, I'll read this out. This comes from her diary, one of her diary entries. So Katie said, in time, the designer, which is Katie, could see that Tom, who was the one of the men she worked with, one could see that Tom looked content and relaxed, sitting quietly, picking at the leather on his sofa. Unable to ask Tom directly, what do you like about doing that? Katie then mirrored Tom's actions and experienced it for herself. So she started to pick the leather off the sofa, which enabled her to externalize her thoughts and begin to understand and empathize with Tom. She found that picking the leather off the sofa was surprisingly satisfying, similar to the satisfaction one might get from kind of popping bubble wrap. So instead of a ruined sofa, Katie now perceived Tom's sofa as an object wrapped in fabric that is fun to pick. And reflecting on these observations, Katie describes how her initial perception of Tom's home environment, and the sofa in particular, was one of destruction. That's what she started off with. But it was only through her sustained interactions with Tom, where she got to know him, his sensory preferences, and his unique affordances with the environment, which signaled his way of being in the world, that she began to see things anew from his perspective. That is, she began to explore the subjective significance of autistic experience. Now, Katie's a designer, and so she used these experiences, and in addition to information that she gained from talking with support workers and also family members, to design a series of objects and activities which were directly informed by her interactions with the autistic people that she was working with. So one of the autistic adults she worked with really loved bubbles. And so she was kind of interested in knowing how it would approach kind of like domestic chores, for example. And this particular person loved doing the dishes, because there could be lots of bubbles involved in doing the dishes, but hated doing the vacuuming, really hated doing the vacuuming. So Katie designed for him a bubble blowing vacuum cleaner, which is what you can see here, which is just awesome. I think everybody would love a bubble blowing vacuum cleaner. But she did this because she, tried to understand the world from his perspective. So Katie's person-centered and participatory methods meant that, her empathetic approach allowed her to gain insight into the life world of a group of autistic people that are so often overlooked in autism research, into ways of being that might otherwise not be immediately apparent to non-autistic observers. And her strength-based, rather than a deficits-based approach, revealed what discomfort and delight might mean for an autistic person, and allowed her to design a series of products to enhance their experience at home. So that was example number 2. So just to conclude all of that. So most, as you know, most autism science has been designed and conducted without any significant input from autistic people and their allies. Encouragingly, this has begun to change, which is awesome. We each, have a responsibility to contribute to that change, including by, genuinely involving autistic people in our research, building on the principles of trust, mutual respect, listening and learning, being creative and being empathetic scholars, and critically addressing those, often entrenched power differentials between researchers and community members. Working in this way, might be daunting. It's not the usual way of working, and it won't be problem-free. But the benefits to research, to its relevance, and above all, to the autistic community will be worth it. Thank you very much.
So thank you again, Liz, for your presentation. Was inspiring, and so I welcome people. There are 2 chat monitors they're monitoring the questions asked in the question and answer chat, and they can report them to you. Quindi invito tutti e tutte a fare domande se non l'avete già fatto. Per Liz Pellicano ci sono 2 persone che monitorano, Martina Fusaro e Anna Giometti, che monitorano la chat e che riporteranno le domande a Liz Pellicano. Approfitto anche per ringraziare Eleonora Marocchini per la traduzione, che è un lavoro da incubus. I also thank Eleonora Marocchini for the translation, online translation on the chat, which is a nightmare. But yes, they are making it possible. Ok, quindi forse Martina, direttamente te vuoi riportare le domande? Chi è che riporta le domande a... I'm asking who's going to ask you the questions that came out, or...
Io posso riportare. Al momento abbiamo una domanda che penso fosse un po' una provocazione iniziale che dice Combat Autism Act, why combat if we can have a better comprehension?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the Combating Autism Act was appropriated by George W. Bush a long time ago, and so I think it was kind of, I guess, inappropriately termed as combating autism, something, that we have to wage war on. But I hope that kind of framing of things has changed quite a lot, not in every sphere, but I hope we're kind of working, as Maria said, towards better comprehension of and respect and acceptance of autistic people, rather than kind of waging war on him, which does sound awful.
Thank you. So the second question we received, I will read the comment. So thank you a lot, Liz. Interesting. Can you tell us more about ethical issues in participatory research with autistic people? And can you suggest any practical strategies to be sure that all this research process will be acceptable?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay. Ethical issues. Let me have a think. I mean, I guess the biggest one for me is the issue of power, which is what I talked about. I mean, I think it's really easy for researchers to kind of take control, because that's how we come up with, that's how we've been trained to do. We come up with research questions, we come up with projects, and then we implement them, and we just kind of, it just kind of goes on. And I think it's really hard for researchers to kind of take that step back and say, well, we're going to do this together. And the ethical issues arise because when researchers don't do that, and so therefore they don't listen to they might not listen to community members' views, or they might not put them into action. They might listen, but then just don't do anything about them. That can cause harm. So it can cause a real lack of trust in the research process and with researchers generally. And as you saw in one of our studies, community members are essentially excluded from the research process, which is just terrible. So I think there is this real potential. We have to be really careful about, when we enact these kind of participatory approaches, to take real, careful attention towards these power differentials, and making sure that kind of people do get to have a say in the way that they feel most comfortable with, and that as a researcher we kind of enact those things. We can't, obviously, you don't do everything that community members want to do. Like similarly, we don't do everything that researchers want to do. It is a collaboration, and so things will need to be negotiated, and expectations will have to be managed. But that's what a collaboration, that's what a relationship is all about. And yeah, so I think that's my biggest. I mean, I'm sure there's loads of other ethical issues, but that's my biggest ethical issue, because I think when that doesn't work, autistic community members are the ones who have to bear the brunt of that. So
another comment and question. Thank you, Liz. I found it interesting that in the beginning you framed research in a spectrum from community interest and academic interest, but then gave us the example of the amazing work that happens when researchers are actually part of the community. Do you think the spectrum is so diametrically opposed?
Not now. I don't think so now. I think we are seeing. So actually, what I should have said is that in our Hidden Histories project, our autistic researchers, so the ones who actually did the interviews, they were not researchers. So they were community partners who we trained to be researchers for that particular project. And two of them now, they're both doing PhDs now, which is amazing. But at the time, they had never been involved in any research before. So they weren't researchers at that point. They now are researchers, which is awesome. But what is so encouraging is that there are more and more autistic researchers, training as researchers, and who are now part of the autism scientific and non-scientific community, which I think is brilliant. And more people who are also kind of feeling, who might have already had a diagnosis or identified as autistic, but might not have felt like they could kind of come out as autistic. And I think more and more people are disclosing, which is awesome too. That's not always the case, because I think there are instances of places, including conferences and or even labs where things might not be as safe as they could be. But I think that's a really encouraging trend. So it's not just like, researchers versus community members. And I'm sorry if I kind of put it like that, but I think there is a melding now. But there's still, we still have a lot of work to do.
We have a question also from Eta Pucchi that will talk tomorrow. But do you have any thoughts on how we could measure the impact of participatory research in society on a wider scale than just among the people who participated directly?
Hi, Heta. That's a very good question. I think some of this is around is looking at kind of wider shifts in, or this could be done, looking at the kind of shifts in what gets researched in autism research. So one of the projects that Jack Ten Houting and I did in Australia was look at the state of autism research in Australia at the time. And so we were interested in what research had been conducted and how much money had been spent on it. And, for other countries, I didn't show this, but for the most part, there's most autism research focuses on the underlying biology and causes of autism. And there's not very much at all that goes towards services and supports or, understanding, more lifespan issues or or interventions. And so that's the state of play of autism research generally. But in Australia, we had that autism centre, the CRC, that came into play, and they really encouraged research that would involve community members in the research, and also research that was prioritised by autistic people. And we know that autistic people they also want some basic science, but they also, particularly want research that's going to make a difference to their lives. And so what the Autism CRC did was start to fund research, to put money into research that was on topics that were prioritised by autistic people and would involve them in the research itself. And so when Jack and I looked at the kind of nature of the research in Australia, what we actually found was that over a 10-year period, the research started off like mostly biological. And then after the Autism CRC started funding more research that actually mattered to people, we started to see a shift. So there was a much more balanced profile in the research. So we saw essentially more research that had more practical impact, which again is awesome. So I think that that's just one example, but that's one way of looking at it kind of at least a top-down shift. This was a funding agency who was giving money to autism research, and so I think that's one way of seeing that we might an impact of a participatory approach, or more broadly on autism research. I hope that answers your question, Etta.
And then Marina asked, how can we recruit autistic communities that can actively participate in participatory research, considering that they are many and that we want to obtain something which is representative?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I have two answers to that question. One is to say that so lots of the autistic people I work with are, and I often have different groups of people that I work with for different projects because they bring different sorts of expertise to my projects and or our projects, and they and so sometimes we kind of tend to work with, it is a collaboration. So, and if you've had a really successful collaboration, you might think, well, I'll just, ask those people again because because it worked last time and I love working with them. So we'll keep on working with them. But that does mean, as you say, Marina, that there's not this kind of, people don't have the opportunity then to get involved in research. And so now what we are doing is essentially we kind of put expressions of interest out, or we ask people to write an expression of interest if they would like to be involved in a particular research project, in order to try and kind of gain the input of people who might not have been ever involved in research like this before. And so we've done this via social media quite a few times now, and it's been really successful. So we've been able to get really lovely groups of people who have been able to, contribute to the research. Most of this is done online, and who also are representative of. Well, they're not necessarily representative. That's not true. I can't say they're representative, but who might be more representative of community members rather than people who've been involved in research multiple times. We also try and, when we ask about expression of interest, we ask also people to give some background details. So on ethnicity and on gender and age, just to make sure that we're kind of getting a range of people with different backgrounds as well.
Then we have can an autistic person join participatory research project while living abroad? If so, how? I don't know if it means to join like remotely. I think so.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, absolutely. So I mean, since COVID, COVID was bad for so many reasons. But one good thing that came out of it was that we are now more connected than ever before, and that we can do, have webinars like this, which is amazing. And so most of our research is done online. And so for one project, actually, I had an advisory group meeting yesterday for a project on autistic inertia. And there are two people from Australia and one person from the UK. And so who doesn't live in London, so we can't meet in London or can't meet in England. And so that is all done online. So absolutely people can be involved. And that is the beauty of the kind of way we're working now. So.
And then we have Maria Letizia Fiori that asks, your approach is a very psychological one. As for you, is it possible a collaborative research even in psychiatric research? What do you think?
Yes, absolutely. Even in basic science. So I think, I mean, I think it's kind of easier in many ways for a lot of the work I do now is qualitative in nature. And that's not, I didn't deliberately go for that choice of methods. It's just the kinds of questions that me and my community partners are interested in answering, that kind of we've been tending towards a more qualitative methodology. But I think that a participatory approach is, just as important or even more important in more basic science research, where some of the kind of ethical issues, you probably remember around Spectrum 10K and the kind of, the biobanks more generally, animal models of autism, all those kind of things where, autistic people probably don't have any say about how those projects are funded, how they're carried out, how they interpret the data, all those kind of things. And I think even in those studies, we should be definitely including autistic people, because they make up the bulk of actually autism research. And autistic people and their allies should have a say in how that research gets done, or even if it should be done.
So are there any other questions, Martina?
No, at the moment no, but if se ci sono altre persone che vogliono fare domande possono digitare nella chat. So...
Io ne faccio una in the meantime. I ask a question. Yeah. So I cannot write in the chat myself to ask questions, only to answer. So that's why I'm asking it by voice. So learning from one's own mistake, can you share with us mistakes you've made or things that you would have liked to have done differently? And then, because it's good sometimes to say, okay, that did not work, and not only see what worked, because...
Yeah, I can definitely learn from mistakes. In fact, now I also... In every project we do, I have we do like a mini evaluation, so of the participatory processes, so that we, people can tell us or kind of tell someone who's outside the research group about their experiences, because we want to make sure that we're doing better every single time. So one of the biggest things for me was advisory groups. So we used to have advisory groups of community members. And we would meet with advisory groups are kind of, halfway up, if that, of the participatory ladder, that ladder. And, I think they're a great first step. So, sometimes you just can't do full co-production or whatever you want to do. And so I think they're a great first step, particularly for people who are starting to get, or who want to involve community members. I think it's a great first step. For me, I felt that I often felt that because we wouldn't meet advisory group members very often, like 2 to 3 times over a year, or maybe over the life of a project, in part because that's what we had told them, so those were their expectations, but also that's the amount of funding that we had to pay them to do that. But I often felt that we would go to the meetings and we'd kind of almost be reporting. So we'd just be telling people what we did or what we're going to do. And people would kind of have a few things to say, but almost it would be like them rubber stamping it. It'd be like them saying, yeah, that's great, kind of thing. And so I just felt that, that's not input. That's not kind of getting their input. And so now I very rarely use advisory groups, unless they're an addition to. So for many projects, I just have, a group of people who I work closely with, as I would collaborators in research. They are my collaborators. They're my partners in research. And sometimes we do have a, advisory group as well as that. And that's kind of sometimes just to oversee the process. But for the most part, I mean, that was the biggest learning for me, is that sometimes that they can be really tokenistic, and I didn't like that. So
thank you for sharing that. I mean, it's not easy to share mistakes, but I appreciate the genuineness, if it makes sense.
Can I just thank Liz Pellicano and say it's been an honor to translate you today.
Thank you so much for translating. You've done an amazing job. I tried to speak slowly, but then, sometimes.
It's fine. I'm bilingual and an autistic researcher on this stuff, so I'm pretty into the discourse, but been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
So if there aren't any other questions from the audience, and so we don't take time from the audience, also the other speakers, if they would like to ask questions, please unmute yourselves and go ahead and ask. So ho detto, se dal pubblico non ci sono per adesso altre domande, invitavo i relatori e le relatrici a farle anche loro. Tendenzialmente uno pensa, lasciamo spazio al pubblico perché c'è meno opportunità di partecipare, ma se è un momento di stallo abbiamo ancora qualche minuto con la disponibilità di Liz Pellicano. So, okay, I take the opportunity to say one more thing. That we had the opportunity with this Autism Participatory Research Working Group to have 2 trainings with the Autism Sylvia Roger Academy group with 4 autistic consultants or community members, and I cannot remember her name now. Can somebody help me? What's the name of the non-autistic person that she's in of Sylvia Roger Academy? Blonde.
Olivia.
Yes, Olivia Gatfield. So we had really a nice opportunity to have 2 hours meeting with them, and for example, having pauses and allowing people to think. If there are questions, it's also a matter of accessibility. So Silke Limski, if I pronounce your name correctly, wants to ask a question.
You're good.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk, Liz Pellicano. And I do also have a participatory research group that I'm a member of. I'm an autistic researcher myself, and we've been doing this since now it's 17 years in Germany now. And I wanted to ask you about a problem I face when we present our work and when we try to make points that result from this, from the research we do as valid points for autistic community members. And the German research community by large is facing us with an argument that I have a difficulty to respond to. So maybe you do have an idea. And what they say is that the research we do requires members of the participatory group that are able to understand what we're doing, that are capable of participating in the project we're doing. There are different projects, but different abilities, and they at least have to be able to participate in the project. Now, that seems very normal, that you have to have interest and capabilities in time and so on. But there oftentimes this is turned around against us, and they say if you only include people that are able to participate, then you're not allowed to generalize the results more broadly. And I try to tell them that other research is also not representative in any way, which is not really favorite, if I say that. But to make the long story short, I think it's the representation argument or representativeness argument that we face a lot of times. And I try to tell them, you're a researcher, you know how difficult representativeness is to actually accomplish, meaning hardly at all. But do you have an idea or experiences with this point being raised for participatory research, even though it should be raised all the time?
So I think I don't think this is a particularly sophisticated argument, but, like we could say the same for non-autistic researchers, for any type of research. Like my non-autistic collaborators are not representative of the general population. They just are not. And so if we apply that argument to research more broadly, it would completely fail. So yeah, I think that's a terrible argument. It's a terrible argument. Yeah, I mean, obviously we want to try and be more representative, but I don't think we need, I
mean, sheer the number of people that work in a work group is by nature cannot be as large as you would need to be representative. So for me, it's a very logical point that you try to include a certain range of perspectives, but I'm just struck because the same argument is valid for other research too, and ours is kind of, put aside with this argument. So
yeah, no, that sounds terrible. I mean, I think, it is hard, obviously, to trying to be representative, and it's such a burden for the community members who are involved, because they feel like they have this responsibility then to be representative of their community, which they might not feel, and they shouldn't have to feel. Like, I don't feel like I'm representing the researcher community. So yeah, I don't like that argument at all. But it does make us, it should, so I feel sorry for you that you have to deal with that. But it does kind of, I think it probably hammers home that we do need to try and think of ways to be more inclusive. So maybe not necessarily so representative, but definitely more inclusive. And I know with my research, and I'm sure Christina will talk about this as well, but we try to. I tend to have different community members involved in my different projects, because they're often vastly different projects. And so, for example, the Hidden Histories one I spoke about was on late diagnosis. And so my team was of, people with, who were late diagnosed autistic people. But for another project that we did on autistic parents' experiences of their autistic children's going to school. that all involved autistic parents. So kind of you're trying to match up people's expertise and their experience with the project that you're doing. At least I try to. So it's not, so in that sense, you can't necessarily be representative because you're trying to kind of match up to the expertise. But yeah, I don't really. Christina might have more ideas about how to respond to that.
I have several slides in my talk that are probably applicable to this because that argument really upsets me. So,
Okay, so I think we are in time for the break, so that after the break we can go back and listen to Christina Nicolaidis' talk. Ilaria?
Oh, sorry, there was one last question, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe
So
give that opportunity.
okay, so
Yeah,
the
just
very
last
last
question, yeah.
question,
Thank
and
you.
then we have the break and we come back at 4. So what do you think, Liz, about narrative medicine? It can be considered participatory research.
I don't think I know what that means.
I don't know if I translated correctly, but narrative medicine, I don't know if there is an English term or it's narrative medicine. Okay.
I might add, because narrative medicine may be more of an American term. I don't know if maybe we're having a bit of a translation. Narrative medicine is beautiful and wonderful and fantastic, and often we are listening to and bringing in narratives into how we understand and practice medicine. However, in and of itself, it isn't necessarily participatory. It can be participatory, just in the same way that basic science is in and of itself not participatory or participatory. Participatory is how you approach it, and you can do that with narrative medicine. You can do that with qualitative research. You can do that with quantitative research. You can do that with basic science research. And even though narrative medicine may be much more prone to listening and understanding and believing and building, the experiences, and it's much more tied, I think, into kind of naturally fitting with participatory approaches, it certainly doesn't have to be. And in and of itself, you can have a very non-participatory narrative medicine. So I would just separate again the approach, which is what we're talking about in this conference, from the many different ways we can actually do, research or medicine or practice or advocacy, and those can be woven together.
Okay, thank you, many thanks. Thank you, Liz. It was a really nice talk, and we raised a really interesting pool of questions. So really thanks to you and to everybody that raised the question. And so we're gonna meet in 10 minutes. So we have this break, and I will show the program on the screen for the person that asked, so that you can see what's next.
Thank you.
Okay, so welcome back, bentornate. It's my pleasure to introduce Christina Nicolaidis. She's a medical doctor. She's professor of internal medicine at Oregon Health and Science University. She's the co-founder and co-director of the Academic Autism Spectrum Partnership in Research and Education, in brief, AASPIRE. And she's one of the most renowned experts and researchers doing autism participatory research. So it's really a pleasure to have you here, and go ahead and tell us what you know.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation. Let me share my screen. Can you see that? Wonderful. Okay. So, I think most people, just by virtue of having decided to come to this webinar, probably at some level believe in the promise of participatory research. And, I sometimes feel like, oh my gosh, am I just being a religious zealot? But I really do believe in this promise. You know, the idea is that the more we can include the communities that we're studying and we're working with, the more impact we're going to have in the world, the more good we're going to do, the more we're going to, basically we're not wasting our time. And we think of, this inclusion can increase the impact of our work, both directly by picking better topics and by getting the dissemination out, and also indirectly by actually making our research more rigorous and doing better research by using participatory approaches. But the promise is one thing, and the daily work is what's really hard. My neurodivergence is ADHD. I'm really good on ideas and topics and passion. And then it's the details. And it's the details and details and details and the implementation. And to be honest, that's what makes participatory research work. So when Ilaria asked me to talk about how autism participatory research is conducted, my answer is, I have no answers. Every project is conducted in a different way. But what I do have is a lot of recommendations for what types of things to be thinking about and what types of things to be considering, and all these little details that are so important in actually making that promise of better impact, more equitable research, more useful research come true. So I'm going to be talking a lot about examples from ASPIRE, though I also will be bringing in examples from plenty of other projects. But Dora Raymaker and I co-founded ASPIRE back in 2006. That was back when Dora was my community partner. She has since gotten her own PhD and is leading her own projects and is a prominent researcher in her own right. But ASPIRE has continued, and we've continued to work together. We're a group of both autistic and non-autistic academic scientists. And very importantly, we have a large number of community partners. And these are predominantly autistic adults, but we also have other stakeholders. And as we were just kind of talking about a moment ago, we really try to have an as wide a diversity as possible of lived experience with coming from our community partners. And as we'll be talking about, we use a particular type of participatory research called community-based participatory research, where the idea is that you share power equally between academic and community partners. We have a variety of projects active right now. We've done a lot of work around healthcare. I'll tell you a little bit today about our outcomes project. We have several mental health projects going on, some on autistic burnout, some on suicide prevention. Dora is leading some projects about employment. We're collaborating on some projects about pregnancy experiences, and we've been involved in the past in projects about violence and abuse. But all of this has happened really fast, in the academic sphere, really fast. When we started in 2006, I had already been doing participatory research with other communities, and I was working in a world where, when you study racial and ethnic disparities in the United States, you're expected to do participatory research. But when we started talking about doing it in autism, people acted like we had horns on our head. This wasn't that long ago, in 2011. That's a comment from a grant reviewer who's basically questioning our assumption that autistic people can reflect on their own experience and give a valid assessment of what they need. It's just kind of gross. And even as of 2014, there was a scoping review where our two papers were like the only ones about autism that were using a participatory approach. That's only 10 years ago. In the last 10 years, it's been amazing. Participatory research has exploded in the autism field. And every time you turn around, there's more groups using participatory approaches, and that is wonderful and that is beautiful. And I'm very, very excited that that is happening. It's rare that you get to see such transformation in such a short period of time. But there's a risk of building too fast. And, in the US, we're pretty used to shoddy work, and shoddy work doesn't hold. I'm hoping that we can rely on some good old, Italian craftsmanship around building a strong foundation and really doing things right so that they don't crumble and they don't end up causing more harm than good. I cannot, in 45 minutes, possibly go through all the details that one would need to consider. We have tried with Aspire as much as possible to give resources for others. If you go to our website, you'll find our practice guidelines. You'll also find all sorts of examples and templates and much more detailed question and answer videos than what I'm going to be able to get into today. They don't answer everything. And as I said, we really don't have the answers to everything, but we do hope people will use the resources, and we add to the resources regularly. So let's stand back a second and say, what do we mean by participatory research approaches? There's kind of this alphabet soup out there of CBPR, PAR, CPPR, it's a lot of approaches. What's important is the basic definition. And what distinguishes participatory approaches from non-participatory approaches is that people from the population being studied are part of the research team. Not just being listened to and not, but, they're part of the actual team. These, as we were just mentioning with Liz, are approaches to research. They can be used with any methods. People tend to use them often with qualitative methods, but there's absolutely nothing that is specific to qualitative here that can be used with any methods. And you'll see we use them with a lot of different methodologies. As I said, there's many named approaches. Some of the names are just from different disciplines, different countries, but there are actually important differences. And as I said, there's no one right way to do things, but the details can really matter as you're trying to be as equitable and effective as possible. So also, I'm going to be mentioning a lot about community partners. Who are community partners? Who is the autistic community? And really, autistic community, there's the autism community, and both are important. Autistic people are certainly the core, but family members, disability services providers, clinicians, they're all important and they all bring valuable insights. And the more we can include the broader community, the more we can learn from it. That, however, doesn't mean that we can assume that non-autistic family members or clinicians or others alone can speak for autistic loved ones. It's that combination, and that combination is really important because we need multiple different perspectives. We really value the diversity of lived experience, and we value lived experience as expertise. And that is, people bring different expertise, and they may bring the expertise of the lived experience of being a non-speaking person, or the lived experience of being, transgender, or the lived experience of living in a group home. These are all expertise that comes from lived experience, is what we greatly value. And then we make a conscious effort to center the voices of autistic people. Just because we include others doesn't mean that really we ever can forget that the center has to be the voices of the autistic people themselves. I love this little meme that I can't figure out who to attribute it to, but we have the stakeholders and the other people who all have an opinion on it, but really when it comes down to it, it's the user that matters, and sometimes their perspective may be quite different than that of stakeholders. So I also want to say something about autistic scientists or PhD students, scientists in training, staff, etc. It is absolutely extremely important to increase diversity, including neurodiversity in academia. And insider researchers bring wonderful strengths and perspectives to research. That is just a tenet and a large part of what I've really tried, not just in the since working in autism research and working in research, is to try are best to support and encourage and increase diversity in science. And if there's any doubts, this is just this ridiculous idea that somehow outsider researchers are any more objective or if they're less biased. We just don't see their biases as much because they're part of the majority group. However, just including an insider researcher does not in and of itself make a project participatory. And participatory research can't replace the need for autistic researchers. Autistic scientists can't represent the full range of lived experience. So unless you're doing a project specifically about autistic scientists, you're going to, for it to be participatory, it needs to be more. It's kind of think about it like if every project that was led or included a female researcher that was about women's health was now participatory. No, I mean, it's good to have women in science, and it's good to make sure that women's health projects have women scientists on it, but in and of itself, that does not make a project participatory. Also, I just want to be careful because right now, this will change, but right now, most autistic scientists are either PhD students or early career people. Dora is one of the sort of oldest, not oldest, most, furthest in her career as an openly autistic scientist. And she's just made it into kind of her mid-career. We have a few older ones. And what matters then is these power imbalances because academia is really, really hierarchical. And having an autistic PhD student on the team when the PI is non-autistic is very different than having a community council with community leaders that you can answer to. So I just bring that up and as important and as really some of this is thinking about kind of how we support autistic scientists to do the best work and how we can do participatory research with both autistic and non-autistic scientists. So as I said, there's this big alphabet soup of different types of participatory approaches. And if you're interested, I can babble on and on about the differences. But for today, let's just group them into three big groups. And I think that's largely based on the level of power sharing. So if you're truly trying to get to equal power sharing, that's the goal, not always the reality, but the goal of community-based participatory research and some participatory action research. There's also the goal of authentic inclusion, actually making sure that people are included throughout all steps of the project in an authentic and ethical way. That's often what we talk about in the United States as patient-centered outcomes research, and in the UK, in Australia as co-production. I don't know what terms you use in Italy, I apologize. And then there's the very common consultation type approaches of advisory boards, Delphi panels, etc., where we don't expect any power sharing. We're mostly just getting input that we may or may not use. This is a diagram that Dora made back when we first met, when I babbled about what CBPR was all about. And in Dora's, magical way, she took my babble and made it into this very beautiful diagram that we've used ever since. But the idea of CBPR is that the community as a whole keeps the research respectful, accessible, and socially relevant. The academics as a whole keep the research scientifically sound and academically relevant. Now, individuals may bop in between them. When I talk about what's going to potentially introduce, some statistical bias, I'm talking about in my role as an academic. When I talk about what happened this morning with my son, I'm talking from my lived experience. And there I'm actually talking as a community member. We don't have to be one or the other, but this is what the community and the academics do. And the idea is we work together at each phase of the process to make sure that we're, when we're developing the project, that it meets the community priorities, and also it has scientific value, when we're implementing it, that it's actually accessible and that it's scientifically rigorous, when we're disseminating it, that it actually helps the community and that it can build on an advanced science. I wanted to just make one more note about consultative models, and Liz just kind of hinted at this a little bit in one of her responses to the question and answer session. Consultative models are very common, and they're not inherently evil. They're better than nothing, and they can at times be quite useful. Here we're talking again about advisory boards, Delphi panels, individual consultants. They can be used, but use them with great caution. It's really, really easy to accidentally tokenize people or accidentally walk all over them. Be very clear about your expectations so that they know that they're offering advice and that you may or may not take that advice. And still, it doesn't actually excuse you from all the work it takes to make it accessible, because you still need to provide adequate training, support, accommodations. All those things still have to happen to have a good advisory board. And you still need to focus on collaboration and trust, even if you're not trying to share power. And one note I'd say, especially from my consulting experiences, is be careful when you're ignoring advice. I've had many times where I'm consulting on projects that are using advisory models, and the PI will tell me some story about some ridiculous thing an advisor said, and of course, we're not going to do that. And it's true that potentially the exact recommendation would not work, but there's usually a reason why they're making that recommendation. And when you're not actually trying to come to some joint conclusion, it's easy to ignore that and to move on without having fully understood why that recommendation is being made. So let's talk a little bit about the research team, because that's the core of CBPR, is this team. Again, boring details. I really don't want to think about team infrastructures, but infrastructures matter. Even in CBPR, community-based participatory research, where we're aiming for equal power sharing, that doesn't mean that every person on the team has the same power or responsibilities. What it means is that the academic part of the team collectively and the community part of the team collectively should share power equally throughout the project. But there's still a need for different roles in different work for different team members. Leaders and staff need to do a lot of work in preparation so that full team can make decisions, and then they need to do a lot of work to implement the decisions. I would guesstimate we probably spend 20 or 30 hours preparing for every 2-hour meeting. This is where the work comes in. And this is where the infrastructure matters, because if you're just thinking of the community partners as that 2-hour meeting, that leaves a lot of the power out. And again, there's no one right answer. I have no idea how you should structure your own teams, but thinking about how you set up the roles can make a really big difference. So I'll tell you some leadership options. And again, even just within Aspire, Dora and I have changed how we've done things over time, just because we've grown and we've developed in our own careers. It's very common to just have the leader be a non-autistic academic PI. I haven't done that with autism research, but I'll say the first projects I did with the African American community, I was the PI and I had a whole bunch of community partners. I don't think that's the best approach, to be honest. Insider researchers, now we're talking in this case autistic researchers, being the sole PI, it's a little bit more okay, and it's possible, but I would still advise caution. And I'll tell you, Dora herself does not ever work as the sole PI without another community partner as in a lead position, because because they've realized that it's actually really important to share with non-academic community members. Often we've had academic and community co-PIs where we share it. That's how Dora and I started. That's how I was doing some of my projects with the African American community before I was doing autism. That works really well if there is somebody there who can truly be a community co-PI. And Dora was an amazing community co-PI until she crossed over to the dark side, and now she can no longer be a community co-PI because she's a darn academic. Since Dora was stopped being my community co-PI, we had trouble actually finding somebody who could truly be a community co-PI. So what we've been doing in recent years for all of our various ASPIRE projects is we have community project leads. And we have a different community project lead for each project. But that person takes a leadership position, and that's worked really effectively for us in the last few years. We've also had projects where we have a steering committee of leaders from different organizations, or just leaders that are kind of there to guide things, and that's sometimes been helpful. And then the truth is that there are projects where really the leadership is all just community leaders, and they're hiring academics to work as technicians. That hasn't been my favorite role. I like more collaborative approaches, but that's also an option to be considered. So other team structures, who's everybody else? There's all these academic partners, and normal research has co-investigators and consultants and students and staff, and we still have them. They're still important. Similarly, with the community partners, I like thinking of community councils because that's not just an advisory capacity, but you can have advisory boards. And then within my projects, oftentimes, we have so much work to do that we'll have smaller work group members where we're taking a little piece of a project, and these 2 or 3 community partners are working on this work group for this particular issue or this particular question, and we have other people working in other work groups for those particular issues. And then largely we've been talking about projects, but as groups get bigger, sometimes you have to think about an organizational structure versus a project level structure. And what we've been doing in ASPIRE is we have an organizational structure, and then we have different project levels. So each project has its own team, each project has its own community project lead, its own principal investigator, its own consultants and co-investigators and community partners. But then we also have a larger council that drives ASPIRE as an organization. That didn't come right away. That came after years and years of working and growing into a larger group. So, and we've talked about what makes community partners, but who do we actually include? And this gets a little bit to the question that was asked in the Q&A period around, is this a representative sample? Of course not. That's ridiculous. What I tell people is, do I get a representative sample of statisticians every time I try to do a project? That's ludicrous. This is not your study. This is your team. We need to include community projects that fit the needs of this particular project. It's not a random sample. It's not a representative sample. But it is in some ways a little bit of a purposeful sample. In that, just the same way that I would pick the right statistician by somebody who is interested and committed to this thing, I need to have people who are actually interested and committed to it. My son would never be part of any of these projects. He thinks this is all boring and would be, just that he wants to make movies. Like, it doesn't mean that every autistic person that might potentially participate in our studies would want to be a part of a research team. However, that doesn't excuse us from the diversity of lived experience that we need to bring. I can't just pick a statistician. I need to have a statistician who, if I'm doing a multi-level, model using a growth curve, I need a statistician that knows about growth curve modeling. And that may or may not be the statistician that knows about how to, best do a factor analysis. What I need is the lived experience that's going to be important for this project. And often we need a diversity of lived experience in demographic characteristics, race, ethnicity, age, gender, and also in disability characteristics. It's really a lot easier, honestly, to work with community partners who have the best communication skills, who have high IQ, who already have a high educational attainment. That's great, but we also need to work with community partners who don't. And we've worked really hard over the years, and I think that's something we've had to actively improve on, because we didn't start doing that very well, in terms of bringing in community partners who have intellectual disabilities, community partners who are non-speaking, community partners who live in more restrictive environments. And that's been a real focus for us in the last, probably I'd say 5-6 years. We've done a much better job of that. We also bring in people who have lived experience of taking care of autistic adults who can't possibly participate. And we have parents on our team who bring the lived experience that comes with caring for someone who, even with all the supports and accommodations we can possibly make, aren't able to participate in the project themselves. And then, as Liz kind of mentioned, there's project-specific issues. If we're doing a project on employment, we need to have people who, are seeking or have been employed. If we're doing a project on pregnancy, we have people who have experience with pregnancy and so forth. And that is just the way we would for any other research project. The other thing is to have a mix of community leaders and people without significant community leadership roles. This is really important. If you don't have any community leaders, it's by accident, you can step on people. We don't mean to, but we do. Community leaders have power that comes from their community leadership role. And that's really important when we're trying to kind of build these really delicate power dynamics in teams, to have people that come in with their own power, the power that comes from being in a leadership position. But then that lived experience may be different than somebody who doesn't have a leadership role. And that's where we've really tried to make sure that we have both. And we've tried to make sure that the community leaders understand the importance of making room and space to listen to folks who might not be in leadership positions. So what makes a good collaborator? It's trust, and you need trust in both directions. We often think about what makes a good academic partner, and they have to ultimately be genuinely committed to power sharing, co-learning. That's hard. A lot of wonderful, wonderful researchers are really just not going to ever want to share power. And those are not the best people to bring onto a participatory team. I've unfortunately made that mistake for people that I've, greatly admired, but it just does not necessarily work in a participatory situation. Academics really need to be open to doing things in non-traditional ways, and they can't just step aside. I've also had academic collaborators who are so afraid of disagreeing with something that an autistic or a community partner has said that they don't then do their job. And their job is to bring in their academic expertise. So you can't just step aside. You need to be able to explain what the scientific issue is in an accessible way, to be able to have a discussion, to be able to then figure out some solution. And finding these academic partners who are both willing to listen and also not afraid to speak is important. The community partners too, though, we need to trust. And there are community partners who are going to be wonderful in participatory projects, and others who it's best for them to use their skills in other ways. In general, we need community partners who are going to prioritize the project goals over individual gains. And just my general rule is to avoid people who seem to attract a lot of drama, because that's just not the best place for this. Oftentimes those people, again, are incredible, and I learn from them, and we use their ideas and their concepts, and I greatly admire them. But we need people who are going to be able to work as a team. We also, though, want to avoid people who are going to go along with anything we say, because that's not helpful. And if somebody isn't going to be able to speak up, a lot of it is our creating an environment for them to be able to speak up, making it a safe place so that they can speak up, making it as accessible as possible so that they can speak up. But ultimately, we are looking for people who are going to speak up. Again, family members, caregivers, clinicians, other stakeholders, we welcome them, we embrace them. They bring really important lived experience, but they need to do that without treating self-advocates as the enemy. And if somebody comes in basically thinking that it's, them against autistic people, that's just not going to work. And then what we found, honestly, a little bit the hard way, is when we're dealing with projects that are sensitive, mental health issues, trauma, violence, other sensitive topics, partners need to be at a place where they can engage in discussions without getting overly triggered. Again, we can do everything we can to make this as safe and supportive an environment as possible, but this can't focus like a therapy session. So it is important to make sure that partners are at a place emotionally where they can participate in the project. So that's a lot of things that I've just told you need. And it's hard to do all that. And again, it's not like we always do it right. This is hard. But bringing together a team, I'd say first, identify academic and community project leaders. People have this idea of, we're going to go recruit a whole bunch of people. Don't go starting to recruit a whole bunch of people without having actually figured out who your leads are. If you need to, form connections with organizations, preferably autistic-led organizations, but organizations that can help you reach into the community, or if you're in the community, working with academics who can reach into academia. And then work with the leadership team, organization, networks to identify others. We've found, again, everybody can do it differently, but we have found that it's really important to prepare accessible, high-level written materials about the project. When I used to do work prior to doing autism work, I actually avoided having anything in writing because I felt like we needed to come up with this all together. And, I would go talk to I would do a project with the Latino community, and it was really important that we, shared meals together and we talked, and I didn't come in having anything in writing. I have found that with the autistic community, writing helps. People really want to see something that's concrete. So we do try to, with the leadership team, again, these are autistic leaders are involved in this, to create some high-level written materials about the project. And we have examples of all these things on our website. And then in some cases, a formal application process is really helpful. In some cases, it isn't. For the first, I'd say 15 years of Aspire, we mostly just did word of mouth and connections and networking. In more recent years, we have had a kind of a formal application process go through social media, all our networks, et cetera. And we've gotten some great community partners that way. So people were asking earlier, and I'm glad, because boy, I can talk about this a long time, about how we work together actually equitably and effectively. And this is where, again, good intentions aren't enough. Really important to regularly focus and build and maintain trust. We have to, again, recognize, respect the community cultures and values, as well as respect the importance of scientific rigor. People on all sides have to actively listen, and we demonstrate that we value lived and professional experience by our actions. Follow through, implement the group decisions, regularly report on progress, and just celebrate success, make fun, humor. This isn't all just drudgery. This is actually really cool stuff. And as Liz was saying, regularly evaluate the collaboration. That's really, really important. So launching a project. We do a lot of individual onboarding so we can get to know each individual person. We review the basics, handle all sorts of logistics. There's a lot of stuff that happens in the background. And this is important for identifying individual accommodations. Some accommodations are kind of general, and we know people are going to need closed captioning or people are going to need this or that. But some are they actually need to be reminded of meetings through Facebook, not through email. That's an accommodation. These are individual things. And then we have individual group, we have initial group kickoff meetings where we overview the project. And then really importantly, we get to know each other and we do visioning exercises. The visioning exercises are key because that's what actually gets people to see the passion. When the community partners see that academic partners aren't all in it just simply to get more papers on their CVs, but they actually really care about what this is going to do, that's really important for creating trust, and vice versa. And then we have group discussions around how we're going to collaborate. And every single project collaborates a little bit differently based on the people that are in the group and the potentially competing accommodations that are necessary in the group. We do trainings, and we have separate trainings for academic and community partners. Academic partners to help them better understand autism and participatory approaches, and community partners to get a little bit of the background of the science so that they can take active part in the process. And then we do have formal agreements about authorship, presentations, confidentiality. Again, we have examples of all these on our website. Email. Oh my gosh, email is such a pain in the neck. And email is a pain in the neck for everybody, but the added levels of how difficult it can be for participatory research are astronomical. There's a lot of information. People have different backgrounds. People want transparency. They want to see everything. Other people get totally overwhelmed by seeing everything. So we've worked really hard to try to have effective emails. We have structured purpose, actions, deadlines, stipend, summary with very clear at the top before we ever get to any of the details. We do things in question and answer format. We very clearly mark what's optional for the people who want more transparency so that the people that get overwhelmed know they don't have to look at it. And even with all of the work, I mean, honestly, it takes me hours to prepare an email that goes out to my full team. Even with all that work, there are people that just are going to get overwhelmed with email. So we always have an option. Any email that goes out, that there is an option to go over it, over Zoom with the research assistant and not have to read any of this stuff. Holding team meetings. I don't know how you're going to hold your meeting. Every team's different and every situation's different. One thing I can tell you though, pretty much if you think you can do it audio only, you're probably wrong. I would not, it's the only thing I would say, don't do audio only. However, we've done in-person meetings, we've done remote meetings, every combination thereof. If you're doing in person, think about what happens in person. What's the sensory environment? What fidgets are you going to provide? How are you going to have some quiet spaces? Are you going to provide captioning? Same thing with remote. We'll talk more about remote in a second because that's what we've been doing more recently. And then prepare before the full team meetings. One thing we found is that when we had everybody in the meeting, when we had community partners only, then we didn't actually have true collaboration. When we had the full team, sometimes the academics would get all caught up talking about some academic detail amongst themselves, and they wouldn't leave space for the community partners. So we actually have survey week meetings the week before our full team meetings, where we go over, we let the scientists kind of hash out whatever scientific arguments they want to have, so that then at the full team meeting, we can center the community partners, but the scientists are there to be able to weigh in as needed. We send materials in advance. Again, I'm an ADHDer. I want to do everything at the last minute. This hurts. But we are just absolutely, we have to send them at least 5 days in advance. And we send them in multiple formats. We have the materials, everything they need to prepare for the meeting in tons of detail for the people that want to expect and prepare for everything, in an easy read format for our folks who have intellectual disabilities or who read at a lower level, and in a compact format for the people who don't necessarily have an intellectual disability but are really busy and just want to see the most important points. And then we have an optional pre-meeting for people who weren't able to get through the meeting materials, where a research assistant just basically talks them through all the materials that we're going to be using for a meeting. Meetings, again, no one right way to do it, but this is what we're doing right now, which is working for us. We use a Zoom video conference. with professional closed captioning. We put the slides in the main content, and we try really hard to have the slides be simple without a lot of words. This would not be a slide that I would put in a full team meeting. Fewer words, less busy. We share the screen when we're working together actively. So if I'm making word changes collaboratively in a document, I'm doing it on the screen, and we're seeing the changes as we go. We have a very clear agenda and strong facilitation. We ask people to raise their hand to speak, though we have accommodations for those who can't do it. I have research assistants who work as chat monitors, AV monitors, timekeepers. We take frequent breaks. It's really important that there aren't two different conversations, one in the chat and one happening verbally. So I don't know if I have a slide about that. No, I don't have a slide about that. So we have a whole etiquette that we've written out around how to use the chat so that the chat is there as an accommodation for people who need it, but there aren't back and forth conversations going in the chat. And we stop, we read everything that's in the chat, we discuss it, and then we move on before going. And if people just want to make extra comments in the chat that don't want to be read out loud, we ask them to put them in parentheses, or we ask them to put ... when they're about to say something and we know we should wait. Pauses are really important. Anytime we're making a decision, we make sure to actually leave a 30 to 60-second pause before we move to the next topic. It is so hard for me. I rush through everything in life. I actually have to have a timer next to me and force myself for these incredibly long pauses that it feels like, because that's where people actually speak up, when I've managed to keep my mouth shut for 60 seconds. Shared decision-making is really, really, really important. We think we're making shared decisions, but there's different levels of power, different communication styles, etc. And then remember, we were just talking about this being, everybody's bringing their particular lived or scientific or professional expertise. Voting doesn't work, because if the one person who's there who knows the statistical method says no and everybody says yes, we now have a bad research project. If the one person or the two people or the three people who have an intellectual disability don't understand this and the others do, and we vote, that failed. So we cannot use voting in these situations. It doesn't work. I find it really helpful to have a formal consensus process. That makes sure that everyone has a say. It encourages creative solutions and problems. And people worry, oh my gosh, but like one person can veto it? Yeah, one person. If one person feels strongly enough to veto it, I don't want to move on. Honestly, I think it actually makes the process faster, because we stop wasting time and just talking about things everybody is already agreeing on, and we can really hone in on the things where we need to actively make a change. And then collaboratively disseminate findings. I'm running out of time, so I won't go into it, but obviously a lot goes into co-producing both scientific products and also community products. And then, as Liz said, continuous improvement, continuous improvement, continuous improvement. I've been doing participatory research now for like 25 years. You'd think I would have figured it out. Oh my gosh, I haven't. Every single time there's something that we could do better. And sometimes it's not even so much like that this one thing is so important. The fact that we're changing things, the fact that we're listening is probably the most important. We have feedback after each meeting. We always allow anonymous online feedback, and then we do more in-depth project evaluations at project milestones. And ultimately, actions speak louder than words. What matters is that when there's been a problem and you say you're going to fix it, you fix it and you do your best. Ultimately, the goal is to build a culture of trust and learning and forgiveness and continuing adaptation. And that is what makes participatory research projects so much fun. I love my community partners. I love my teams. They are just some of the most supportive, most wonderful teams, but it takes work to make that happen. I'm kind of running out of time, so I'll just go real fast. Participatory research affects the actual research. So, and that's everything from choice of topic to consent materials to data collection, interpretation, development, dissemination, everything. I'll give you an example of choice of topics. people would kind of randomly mention autistic burnout in Dora's one of Dora's employment studies. It's the community that said, "Oh, this isn't just this random term they're throwing out. This is something we really care about." I tried to talk about this to, and not, to funders, to researchers, to clinicians. Nobody cared. We did a project on it because our community partners wanted this project. And when it was published, I mean, within days, we had hundreds of thousands of downloads and tens of thousands of comments on social media, all of them just extremely, extremely excited about how important it was. Now, clinicians are asking for this and funders are asking for this, but this wouldn't have happened if the community didn't say, "Hey, this is really important to us." Consent forms, a lot of somebody earlier had talked about kind of ethical issues. Well, part of the ethical issues is how we actually do our ethics for our projects. And a lot of projects are not actually ethical in my perspective, either because they're including people who have not actually truly participated in a real informed consent process, or they're excluding people unnecessarily because they think they can't actually participate in an informed consent process when they can. We work with our community partners really, really hard to come up with accessible consent forms and accessible consent processes that only really work because I have my community partners working with me to make sure that these materials are as accessible as possible. Qualitative data collection. Originally, when we started doing this, people told me you couldn't even do qualitative research with autistic adults. Now, like 3/4 of the manuscripts that are submitted to my journal are qualitative. That's changed a lot in a few years. But what hasn't changed is the challenges of doing qualitative research with autistic people. And it's my community partners who really help make sure we have creative and effective interview guides and good strategies for collecting data. Quantitative data. Oh my gosh. For years, I mean, I do a lot of survey research. Since we started, my community partners have looked at validated, psychometrically tested survey instruments, and they find them to be utterly inaccessible. They say, and ultimately, if we're not collecting data using instruments that people can understand and can reliably fill out, the rest of the science is junk. So we did this as part of projects for years and years, but now the last 5 years, we have a big multi-million-dollar project from the National Institute of Health to come up with a toolbox of accessible instruments that can be used to evaluate the effectiveness of services for autistic adults. We did a process to choose which outcomes to put in there. We spent 2 years working with our community partners to adapt and create instruments for each of the most important outcomes. And now we're doing a prospective cohort study with a little over 750 autistic adults to test the measures, psychometrically test the measures, and then to assess changes in outcomes over time. We just finished collecting our cohort, and I'm so excited. We have like a wonderful cohort, and very, very excited to soon be giving information about that. I will skip the details of how we do all this, but I'll tell you that there's a lot of common concerns that can be changed. A lot of difficult vocabulary, complex sentence structure, response options with vague terms. What's the difference between some of the time and a lot of the time, or a little of the time and some of the time? Items that can be capturing autistic traits, context where answers would be different in one context versus another context, etc. We do a lot of types of adaptations over and over again to address these issues. And these, again, aren't just done where now we know how to do it. All of them we do with our autistic partners so that for each individual instrument, we've got the best chance of having it be accessible and reliable and valid. We've also had concerns that we couldn't fix. There was a number of scales that we just couldn't adapt because there wasn't an instrument that really measured the construct that was important to people, or They were just so inherently ableist or offensive or pathologizing that we just couldn't fix them, or and so forth and so forth. Or they're kind of cool instruments, but they're not going to be responsive to change, or they're too burdensome to use. So we've created about 20, I don't have them all listed here, new instruments as part of this project. And again, we've done a lot of work to get to this point, and we'll be testing them. Intervention development. We'd worked with our community partners to create the AASPIRE Healthcare Toolkit. Again, it's not just doing the science, is actually creating the intervention with them. This was done, every page of it, every sheet was done, both what was necessary and then to make sure it was useful in partnership with our community partners. And then I just have to make a plug that it's not just individual research projects. The incredible opportunity about 6 years ago, which popped out of the sky, where this publishing company, a scientific publishing company, contacted me asking me if I wanted to be editor-in-chief of a new journal they wanted to start, Autism in Adulthood. And I was like, for whatever reason, I took the plunge, but I told them that I would only do it if, in fact, we could really bring a participatory approach to the peer-reviewed literature. And it's been incredible. Our journal focuses on the most pressing issues affecting autistic adults, but we've really tried to make sure that autistic adults are present throughout as editors, deputy editors, board members. We have an anti-ableist language policy. Each manuscript that goes through peer review gets both a traditional scientific review, which could be by an autistic scientist, but unfortunately most scientists are not autistic, and it gets reviewed by an autistic adult, often not within academia, to make sure that it's important and culturally relevant, and respectful and strengths-based. We have an insights section that are person first perspectives and memoirs from autistic adults. And I'm estimating about a third of the articles we've published includes some autistic authors or co-authors, which I think is much higher than the general population. And I don't tend to care about metrics very much, but I put our metric up there because people often make it seem like if you do all these things, you're not going to succeed by kind of traditional metrics. Well, the traditional metric for measuring the impact of a journal is an impact factor. I much care about real impact than impact factor, but we got our first impact factor this year, and it was the highest amongst all of the autism journals. And I think that's a tribute to how much the community has been involved with this, and a tribute to how many people have just devoted so much time and energy and effort to a brand new journal because of the participatory ethos that we brought to it. So a few take-home messages. Participatory research approaches, I really do believe, can increase the impact of both research and advocacy work. I'm an action researcher, so I care about both. But they take a lot of effort. There's no one right way to do participatory research, but you have to pay close attention to all the little details that ultimately affect accessibility, power sharing, inclusion, and success. It's really important to build a culture of continuous learning, and ultimately, it's so worth it. I make it sound like it's a lot of work, but it's so much more fun and so much more important and so much more impactful. We all spend a lot of time on our professional and activist endeavors, and this makes them truly worth it. Thank you so much, and thank you to my tons and tons of community partners and academic partners and funders that make this possible. And sorry for going over time.